Hi, thanks for coming to my talk. I'm Michael Townsen Hicks of the Frame Phys project at the University of Birmingham. And I'm going to deliver a talk here called A Practitioner's Guide to Pragmatic Humanism. You can see the slides for this talk on my webpage, www.townsendhicks.com. I'm going to post a link to that in the description. If you have any comments or thoughts, go ahead and put them in the comments or email me at hicksmt@gmail.com. You can also find my email address at my webpage, along with a bunch of other really great research. So I've got other papers up there you can look at in addition to this one. So go over there and check it out if you're into it. And now let's get to it. Today I'm going to talk about a sort of new development in the way Humeans about laws of nature understand the laws of nature. So Humeans are roughly people who think that there are no necessary connections between distinct existences, in line with David Hume, and therefore think that causation and other kinds of modal truths, facts about like what must happen or can happen, have to in some way reduce to or be explained by what does happen. And I'm specifically going to be looking at Humeans about laws of nature, the laws of nature like the laws of physics, who think that those in some way reduce to descriptions about what actually happens. Pragmatic Humeans recently have thought that we should understand this reduction in terms of what laws of nature, what descriptions of the world are useful for us given our purposes. So there's a real focus on the application of laws for agents like us. And what I'm going to ask is, how should that usefulness requirement guide our account of laws, and who the us is, who is us that the laws need to be useful for. Great. So in this talk, I'm going to briefly outline the Humean account of laws of nature and pragmatic laws, modifications of it. Then I'm going to present and respond to a worry from David Lewis. He worried that if the laws depended too much on us, this would turn the view into a rat bag idealist view instead of a proper, good, realist, objective view. And I'm going to also, if I have time, but I'll probably have to do this really quickly, discuss and respond to a similar worry that's been raised recently by Shamik Dasgupta, who worries that not only the laws, but also the property structure, what properties the world is made out of at its most fundamental level, might in some way be conventional, or something like that anyway. Okay, great. So kicking off, what is non-pragmatic humanism? So what you might think of as orthodox humanism is a view that comes to us from David Lewis. It's sometimes called the best system analysis of laws, or the Mill-Ramsey-Lewis account of laws, because Lewis drew on work by Frank Ramsey and John Stuart Mill. And basically, it's a combination of a metaphysical view about what the world is made out of, and a recipe or a way of getting the laws of nature out of that view. So we have a recipe for coming up with laws of nature, and that recipe has two parts. It has this kind of metaphysical account of the world's property structure. According to the traditional Humean, the world is fundamentally made up of perfectly natural properties spread out across space-time. So we can think of this as like a mosaic, where you have a four-dimensional space-time manifold, and then at each point in that manifold, there's some properties. And that's fundamentally all the world is. And those properties are distinct existences. So there are no necessary connections between them. They're in some way freely recombinable. That's what makes the view properly Humean. And then we have an account of laws, of how you get laws out of that. That's kind of the instructions in the recipes. So recipes come with both ingredients and instructions. The instructions tell you to take the facts of the world and come up with the simplest, most informative axiomatic systematization you can of these facts, and the general axioms of that are the laws of nature. So it's an account of the instructions. This is sometimes called the best system analysis, tells you how to generate the laws from this very sparse metaphysical picture where there's just properties spread out across space-time. The laws are like summarizing it. Pragmatic Humeans have departed from Lewis's original formulation by introducing features of agents to both parts of this recipe, both the ingredients and the instructions. So the way they've modified the account of ingredients is as follows. Instead of, they agree that the world consists mostly of non-modal facts, except with recent work by Lower, but we'll ignore that. but they think the world might not have a preferred fundamental property structure. So the laws can use any predicates you like, as long as it's useful for agents to think that way. Maybe that's why we have special sciences. So there are papers by Marcus Schrank, Craig Callender, and Jonathan Cohen. I have a paper with Jonathan Schaffer, which has a view kind of like this. And there's recent work by Barry Lower, which also argues for this kind of view, where the property structure is in some way determined by what it's useful for scientists to plug into their laws. And then second, and I'm going to focus on this more for most of the talk, Humeans have thought the instructions, the way you generate the laws out of that mosaic, might have more to do with our purposes for laws than Lewis thought. We might want to tailor the virtues that laws need to have, or maybe the way we understand informativeness and simplicity, to our purposes for using laws. And those purposes include things like prediction, explanation, and decision-making. Papers that have defended this kind of view include Ned Hall's paper in the companion to David Lewis, a paper by me called Dynamic Humanism, and recent papers by Chris Dorst and Siegfried Jag and Christian Love. And those are in the bibliography, so I would check them out. They're all great papers, I think. Great. So here's Ned Hall kind of describing this move. He says, the official idea is that laws are or correspond to true statements that collectively encode in a highly efficient manner a large amount of information about the world. But the unofficial position is a kind of ideal observer view, according to which the fundamental laws are whatever a suitably placed observer implementing the best scientific standards for judging what laws are would take them to be. And Humeans, think that we should motivate the scientific standards for judging what laws are in terms of the practice of science and the application of science. This is what kind of pragmatic Humeans add in. Okay, so I think that this view is more susceptible than Lewis's view to what I call the Rap Bag Idealist Objection. So here's a quote from Lewis. The worst problem, says Lewis, about the best systems analysis is that when we ask where the standards of simplicity and strength come from, the answer may seem to be that they come from us. Now, some rat bag idealist might say that if we don't like the misfortunes that the laws of nature visit upon us, we can change the laws. In fact, we can make them always have been different just by changing the way we think. Talk about the power of positive thinking. It would be very bad if my analysis endorsed such lunacy. So what's the problem with rat bag idealism? I can think of two main problems. The first is that Humeanism is a realist view. So often Humeans are accused of being anti-realists in some way, or non-realists about laws of nature, causation, and related notions. But they're not, at least traditionally. They are realists. They're just reductionists. So they think that there are objective facts about what the laws are. And those objective facts are just determined by non-modal facts, by the Humean mosaic or whatever. But ratbaggery seems to threaten this realism because what the laws are might depend on the interests of agents. It might depend on what's useful for agents, right? And then we no longer have objective facts about what the laws are. What the laws are kind of varies subjectively. Second, the Humeans use laws in their accounts of counterfactuals and causation, and so in their accounts of epistemic and practical normativity. So we have these laws and we apply them in our account of what inferences it's rational to make and what decisions it's rational to perform, because the laws underlie causation and our decision theory is causal. Or maybe it's epistemic, but still the laws underlie what predictions it's rational to make. So they also underlie what decisions we should make if we use epistemic decision theory. And if we use causation to determine who gets blamed for doing wrong and who gets praised for doing right, then they also underlie some moral normativity by determining what the causes are. And so if the laws turn out to be subjective, so will the practical, epistemic, and maybe even moral norms. So that seems to be bad. Lewis's ratbag worry seems more pressing for pragmatism. So Lewis had this idea that the laws are just the strongest, simplest set of statements. And that's all there is to it. We don't bother talking about agents or scientists or the purposes of science or anything like that. We just talk about simplicity and informativeness. But Pragmatic Humeans want to introduce lots of stuff about the uses of laws to embedded agents and what embedded scientists need in order to learn the laws or apply them. And it seems like if we're using these features of embedded agents to explain the laws, then if agents had had different features, the laws would have been different, right? So if these features really are playing an explanatory role, then the laws would vary if those features of agents were different. This introduces even more agent dependence into our account of laws. I'm going to suggest two strategies for responding to this. The first I'm going to try to go through pretty quickly. The first is what I call the indirect redirect. And that's to rigidify whatever standards of laws that we in fact have. So we have our own uses for laws. And when we imagine merely possible other agents, or other actual agents in the world who have different features, we could say, no, they're not really talking about laws. The desiderata are the ones that we use. So laws just are whatever meets our desiderata. Simplicity and strength are the ones Lewis had. Others of us have added on other desiderata, like we might want the laws to be continuous or have certain symmetries or something like that. And we just say, even if other agents would find other generalizations useful, those aren't the laws. The laws are the things that meet our desiderata. So we rigidify the desiderata. I just like to point out that this takes us a step away from the kind of ideal agent theory that Ned Hall discussed in that quote. So we should resist the urge to be ideal agent theorists, and we should just go straight to the rigidified desiderata. Craig Calder also has a paper coming out in an edited volume on Humeanism, where he discusses the ideal agent version of the Humean view. But I'm not going to talk more about that here. So Lewis considered this, and he said roughly that he thought at first that it would work, but he changed his mind and thought that it was a cosmetic remedy only. It doesn't make the problem go away, he said. It only makes it harder to state. So why is that? I think the reason is that suppose we met a group that had different standards of simplicity and strength, or different ways that they wanted the laws to be informative. The rigidification strategy tells us that they aren't talking about laws, but are instead talking about something else, maybe schmlaws or something. But if schmlaws play the same role in inference prediction and decision-making for them that laws play in inference prediction and decision-making for us, then it seems like all those things are still subjective. And if we have no reason or no way to tell them that their schmlaws are worse for allocating blame than our laws, then all these things are gonna still turn out to be subjective. So even though we've made laws objective, non-subjective by rigidifying our standards, if we run into a culture or an alien or something like that that has different standards and so is talking about something different, schmlaws, we still won't be able to explain what the substantive things that laws hang on, why those things should be tacked onto laws and not their things, schmlaws. And that seems to make our practices of engaging with laws of nature and modal normativity still subjective in a really worrying way. We've lost objectivity. So just to be clear, I think that we should rigidify our standards, but we should look for standards that are not going to vary between different agents or different groups of agents. So I think that in order to characterize a non-subjective pragmatism, we have to retain pragmatism. So we have to understand agents or understand laws in a way that makes them useful for agents and motivate the desiderata for laws, whether those are simplicity and strength or something else, like obeying certain symmetries or making a distinction between initial conditions and dynamic principles. And we want to motivate those things in terms of the application of laws for physical embedded agents. That's what will make our view pragmatic. But we want to characterize those agents in a way that we couldn't run into other agents that didn't match our characterization. We couldn't run into other agents that had different standards or were such that laws that met the criteria we come up with by talking about agents in this pragmatic way wouldn't be useful for them. So we want a kind of an objective universal characterization of agents. So we need to have a characterization of agents and a characterization of laws based on agents which meets both a pragmatic and an objective, pragmatic constraint and an objectivity constraint. In order to do that, I think we should take a page out of the book of a physicist. So Jim Hartle has, in discussing the physics of time, thought about what kind of agents could experience time. And he's thought that any physical system that engages with its surroundings in a certain way will have an experience of time that's similar to our own. And so he comes up with this kind of very general characterization of agents, which he calls, or physical systems, which he calls an information gathering and utilizing system. And he argues that any system which gathers and uses information in the way this system does will have a certain experience of time. And this is also something that you see in Craig Callender's recent book, What Makes Time Special. I think that we should do the same thing for laws of nature. We should ask, what is it that's, what kind of physical systems will have a notion of laws of nature that they employ in decision-making, prediction, and other practices. What idealizations, what kind of idealized system will do that? Come up with a general characterization that will apply to any system that engages with laws of nature, and then use that to figure out what features laws need to have to be useful for those purposes. So we have this general characterization of an agent that meets our objectivity constraint, applies to any agent. And then we show that laws are generalizations that are useful in a certain way for that agent. That meets our pragmatic constraint. And here I have one. I call this the pragmatic eigus. And the idea is you have a physical system that takes in information. It observes exterior systems. Then it takes in information, makes a representation, combines that representation with some background goals to come up with potential actions. And then it uses the laws of nature to figure out what outcomes will result from those actions, and then uses those predicted outcomes to determine what action to take. So it likes the outcome O1 best, so it behaves in way A1, and then it produces some outcome. But that might not exactly match what it expected, so it observes that outcome and then uses the difference between what it observes and what actually happened to modify its understanding of the law. So we have kind of a feedback mechanism in addition to a predictive use. So we have both kind of an input and output use for laws. The laws are useful for prediction, but they get modified when those predictions don't match what was expected by the agent. All right, great. So we want an agent that learns laws from observation and then uses them to predict the outcome of its behavior. And that's what I've kind of drawn here. So this motivates some desiderata for laws. The laws should permit a distinction between boundary conditions and dynamic principles. Why? Because the agent needs to hypothesize different possible actions, those correspond to the boundary conditions, and then needs to determine what will happen as a result of those actions. So it needs to have different boundary conditions and then have dynamic principles that predict possible outcomes. So we have an explanation for why the laws need to have this important distinction that our laws actually have. And then we also need laws that are informative about subsystems of the universe, kind of bounded subsystems, rather than the universe as a whole. Why? Because that's the kind of thing the agent can observe and manipulate, and also the kind of thing that the agent can represent and act upon. Okay, so I think that this meets both of our criteria. It generates an informative and very non-trivial account of what the laws of nature need to be like, which generalizations are fit to count as laws. So it generates desiderata for lawhood that allow us to distinguish laws of nature from other generalizations about the Humean mosaic or whatever. And it's objective in the sense that any agent will fit this description. And so any agent which uses laws, any schmlaws-like thing is gonna meet the desiderata for laws, or be better if it meets those desiderata. So it's going to be universal in the right way. So it abstracts away specifically from the specific physical implementation of the agent, what the agent's made out of, what kind of observations it can make, and also exactly what its goals and interests are. So the desiderata it generates can't be dependent on our physical limitations, our specific limitations, or our psychology or our interests, right? So it's general enough to apply to any agent. So we don't have the kind of agent dependence we were worried about, even though it's specific enough to highlight the role that laws have in the things that we want them to be useful for, the kind of pragmatic uses we have for laws. Okay, great. So that concludes the response to the Rap Bag objection. And I'm going to be really quick and say that I also think that this will help Humeans who think that the property structure of the world isn't metaphysically fundamental or objective in the way Lewis thought. And there's been an interesting kind of interplay between Shamik Dasgupta recently and Ted Sider, where Dasgupta has argued that if our main interest is in believing truths, we shouldn't distinguish between different properties and say that some properties are better than others. And kind of building on Goodman's GRU problem, the new problem of induction, Dasgupta has argued that gruesome theories, theories which have very unnatural properties like GRU, and I'm not going to explain what that is because I don't have a lot of time, but if you don't know, go read Fact Fiction Forecast. It's a great book. So Dasgupta says, we don't have any reason for thinking that theories that involve GRU are worse than theories that involve more natural properties like green and blue. He thinks that the choice to theorize in terms of green rather than GRU is merely conventional in some way. And here I have a quote. You can read the whole thing if you want to go back and look at my slides, which I encourage you to do. Ted Sider has responded to Dasgupta by saying that since our epistemology is based on laws, and laws are based in this objective metaphysical structure, the better theories will be the ones that are in terms of the objective metaphysical structure. But a number of pragmatists have said, no, the laws can be phrased in terms of whatever scientists want them to be. They don't have to be phrased in terms of the objective property structure. I've argued that. So is Barry Lower. So do we have a response to Dasgupta? Can we come up with an objective set of laws? Or for us, are the laws going to vary with what language different groups use? Might it be merely a convention based on our linguistic habits, which generalizations are laws and which aren't? And I think the answer is no. I think we can take a page out of Peirce's book and say that the laws, the right property structure, are whatever property structure features in the theory that all agents would eventually agree to at the end of inquiry. So I think Peirce had an end of inquiry view of truth. I think we can have an end of inquiry view of what the objective property structure is. And I think that there are kind of two ways that pragmatic Peircean constraints can come in. The first is indirect. It can come from the virtues. And the second is direct. It can come from the agents, directly from the agent themselves. So remember I said that laws have to meet certain desiderata. They're generalizations that meet certain desiderata. I think that not every gruesome theory is going to meet those desiderata. So just because two theories are equivalent in terms of what they say doesn't mean that you'll be able to divide them up into, say, in the same way between boundary conditions and dynamic principles. Theories that carve the world differently might give you different generalizations as your dynamic principles rather than your initial conditions. There might be other ways in which they fail to meet pragmatic desiderata. The pragmatic desiderata might choose one language over another. And then the second thing I think is that there aren't guaranteed to be gruesome agents. So agents observe the world in a certain way and sometimes with tools, but they observe the world in a certain way and use that to form their representations. And there just might be no agents that are having internal states, representations, which are reliably correlated in the long term with gruesome states of the world. And if that's right, then it's an objective fact of the world that there aren't these gruesome theories that agents interact with, right? And so I think that in that way, like the way the agents interact with the world and what agents there are in the world might determine one set of properties to be the real objective property structure rather than the other. I wish I had more time to go into that, but I don't. I think I'm already over time. So I presented two problems for pragmatic Humeans, each of which seems to undermine the objectivity of laws, either by undermining the objectivity of the instructions we have for coming up with the laws out of the non-modal structure, or by undermining the objectivity of that structure itself. And I've argued that by appealing to general features of agents, we can avoid both problems. If you have questions, leave them in the comments below or email me at hicksmt@gmail.com. You can also, once again, check out the slides on my webpage at townsendhicks.com, or you can see my other research there, including some of the papers that I referred to here. So thanks. And hopefully I'll see you around, maybe even in person sometime.